to a General Motors recall involving more than 600,000 vehicles. GM is recalling four-wheel trucks and SUVs.
The truth about GM's $888 million pickup scandal has just been exposed. Engines built with microscopic flaws, trucks seizing like roulette at highway speeds. And when families demanded protection, GM gave them caps worth pennies.
To get a lot of attention when General Motors shows it to us tonight. Today, the company announced that it's making a substantial investment
while pouring nearly $1 billion into shiny new plants. Why did executives bury warnings for years? Why did dealers become the front line of corporate lies? And why are furious owners now leading the fight back? When trust breaks at 70 miles per hour, you paid for safety, and GM gave you a gamble with your family's life. Imagine this moment. You are cruising down the interstate at 70 miles per hour, music humming, your kids laughing in the back seat, when suddenly everything seizes. The steering stiffens like concrete, the brakes go numb, and behind you, an 18-wheeler barrels closer with no time to stop. That is not an inconvenience. That is terror. For generations, trucks like the Silverado or Sierra symbolized continuity. Machines built to last, handed down like heirlooms. These vehicles were sold as dependable, reliable, and rugged, the kind of investment families made with pride. Now, that trust feels broken in an instant. A recall notice is supposed to feel like a precaution. Instead, it reads like a confession. Nearly 900,000 trucks and SUVs recalled across America. Not for minor adjustments, but because their engines could freeze solid without warning. That is not just a mechanical flaw. It is betrayal hiding under a glossy commercial. Families who believed in GM's brand are suddenly left questioning every drive, every highway merge, every trip with children in the back seat. Dependability was supposed to be guaranteed, but executives gambled with lives, knowing the risk. And when the engines failed, the myth of indestructibility collapsed, but the insult didn't stop with the failures. It deepened with GM's so-called solution. The plastic cap insult, they didn't fix your truck. They slapped a Band-Aid on it and called it good enough. When the scandal broke wide open, GM's official fix was not a redesigned engine or a recall that rebuilt trust. It was an oil swap and a plastic filler cap. The company told dealers to drain the original oil, pour in a thicker grade, twist on a cap labeled with a new number, and send families back on the road. That was it. For drivers who had handed over $60,000 or more for a vehicle, this solution felt like being laughed at. How could a problem that stranded families on highways be answered with a cap worth pennies? It was not protection. It was postponement. Engineers admitted privately that heavier oil could not erase the damage already done. Metal shards circulating through defective blocks would eventually scar bearings, grind moving parts, and lock engines. The so-called remedy only stretched some trucks long enough to limp beyond the warranty period. After that, the failures would arrive on the customer's dime, not GM's. This was the insult layered onto the injury, a plastic cap instead of accountability, a thicker oil instead of honesty. It was a calculated cost-saving trick disguised as engineering, and families across the country understood it immediately. They weren't given a fix, they were given a countdown. That countdown only grew louder when the numbers began to surface. If this makes you as frustrated as it makes me, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below with your own experience. Your voice matters, and together, we can demand real accountability. Numbers don't lie. You're not crazy. The data proves what you've been saying all along. Federal records began to capture the stories drivers had been warning about for years. By early 2025, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration had logged more than 40 detailed complaints of sudden engine failures. Some reports described near collisions on interstates. Others told of crashes where families walked away injured but alive. In reality, the true number of incidents may be far higher. The timeline itself is proof of how serious the failures became. In January, regulators opened a preliminary investigation. Within months, the scope ballooned to nearly 900,000 vehicles. That kind of escalation almost never happens unless the evidence is overwhelming. These were not isolated incidents. Failures clustered around the same years, the same engines, and even the same production plants. Even worse, many of the breakdowns happened in trucks with fewer than 30,000 miles on the odometer. These were not tired workhorses at the end of their lives. They were practically new vehicles, bought with faith in GM's promises of strength. The contradiction was glaring. In glossy ads, trucks conquered mountains. In government logs, they stranded families on highways without warning. And yet, for all this data, the company stayed quiet. No commercials admitted fault. No executive apologized. Silence became its own form of betrayal. But the truth behind those numbers ran even deeper, down to the very metal inside the engines themselves. Flaws you can't see. Engines aren't failing from wear and tear. They're failing because they were built wrong from day one. At GM's St. Catharines plant in Ontario, crankshafts and connecting rods were produced with microscopic machining flaws. These errors were so small you could not see them with the naked eye. But size does not matter when it comes to precision. These tiny imperfections, thinner than a human hair, were enough to destroy the delicate oil film separating moving parts. Once that protective barrier collapsed, metal touched metal, bearings scarred, heat spread like wildfire, shards of steel broke loose, circulating through the oil system and turning it into liquid sandpaper. Some trucks seized up after only a few months on the road. These were not beaten-down farm vehicles. They were family machines, still under warranty, bought with the expectation of decades of use. The horror of it all is its randomness. A driver has no way of knowing when the failure will strike. It could happen merging onto a highway, towing a trailer uphill, or carrying children home from school. One day, the truck runs smoothly. The next, it locks up without a second's warning. Dependability is supposed to mean certainty. Instead, GM delivered roulette. What makes it worse is the contrast. The company knows how to build bulletproof engines. They do it for the Corvette, sparing no expense. But for the families who depend on their trucks, corners were cut until safety vanished. The betrayal was invisible, but it was there from the start. And while these invisible flaws told the mechanical story, the real fight was only beginning, in the fallout that spread beyond the factory floor. Dealers under fire. Your hometown dealer is caught in the crossfire, and you are the one paying the price. When the recall storm broke, the first place owners turned was not some glass tower in Detroit, but the local dealership down the street. Almost overnight, those familiar showrooms shifted from friendly sales floors into battlegrounds. Service bays flooded with trucks suffering sudden seizures, and mechanics accustomed to brake jobs and oil changes were suddenly staring at dead engines. Customers arrived with fury in their voices, waving recall notices and demanding answers that the staff themselves did not have. Stop sale orders froze inventory on lots, leaving polished Silverados and Sierras parked like unsellable statues, while families who had placed deposits demanded refunds. Salespeople faced accusations that they knowingly sold defective trucks. Service writers tried to explain fixes they barely believed in themselves, repeating corporate talking points about oil swaps and filler caps while owners demanded real repairs. For many small-town dealers who relied on trust built over decades, this chaos felt like betrayal twice over, by GM, which withheld the truth, and by angry customers who did not see that local employees were just as blindsided. The pressure was relentless. Phones rang non-stop, tempers flared, and more than a few conversations ended in shouting matches. Dealers were left holding the bag, unable to sell, unable to reassure, caught between corporate silence and community outrage. But when dealerships buckled under the weight of broken promises, another battlefield opened up. The courtroom. The courtroom weapon. If GM will not listen to drivers, they will listen to a judge. The recall of nearly 900,000 trucks did not just trigger service appointments, it unleashed a flood of lawsuits. Attorneys who had already fought General Motors in earlier oil consumption cases saw an opening too tempting to ignore. Class actions multiplied almost overnight. Allegations stacked high. Negligence, concealment of known defects, reckless disregard for safety. For drivers, lawsuits were not just about money. They were about justice. Each filing became a public rebuke, a way to force accountability when corporate press releases fell flat. Whistleblowers and internal memos hinted at executives being warned about machining flaws years earlier, only to dismiss them in favor of cheaper fixes. In legal terms, that was explosive. It was not just negligence, it looked like calculated betrayal. Discovery meant secrets would not stay buried. Lawyers demanded documents, emails, and depositions. A memo written years earlier could now surface as Exhibit A in a courtroom, broadcast to the public. That prospect terrified GM's leadership. A courtroom strips away marketing. No glossy ads, no awards, only sworn testimony and data. The risk was staggering. In past lawsuits over oil consumption, damages had soared into hundreds of millions. Now, with nearly 1 million vehicles implicated and injuries already documented, exposure stretched into the billions. Investors noticed. Forecasts were trimmed. Confidence shook. But while the lawyers circled, GM tried to project confidence in a very different way, by bragging about where their money was going. The $888 million slap in the face. While your truck sits broken, GM pours nearly $1 billion into new engines. In Tonawanda, New York, the company announced an $888 million investment in engine production, complete with ribbon-cutting ceremonies and photo opportunities. Executives smiled for cameras, while families sat in loaner cars, wondering if their seized engines would ever truly be fixed. The optics were devastating. On paper, GM claimed the investment was about the future, building next-generation small-block V8s and sustainable jobs for communities. But for owners staring at trucks that refused to start, the announcement felt like a slap in the face. The company had money to pour into shiny new projects, but not enough urgency to repair the failures already on the road. Instead of fixing trust, they doubled down on expansion. To critics, this was proof of the corporate mindset: prioritize growth, investors, and future headlines over the people already betrayed. If executives had chosen to allocate even a fraction of that $888 million toward redesigning or replacing defective parts, families might feel some measure of relief. Instead, they were handed thicker oil and a plastic cap, while GM bragged about new facilities. The symbolism could not be ignored. New plants, new engines, new promises, while the old promises lay stranded on the shoulder. And for many drivers, this arrogance felt familiar because they had seen it before. History repeats itself. This is not GM's first betrayal, and drivers are tired of déjà vu. In 2022, the company defended itself in a class-action lawsuit over oil consumption defects. Plaintiffs testified their trucks burned through a quart of oil every 1,000 miles. Internal documents revealed that engineers had flagged faulty piston rings years earlier, but instead of fixing the design, management chose a cheaper cleaning process. That gamble kept costs low, while engines failed early, often just past warranty. The jury did not buy GM's excuses. Damages climbed into the hundreds of millions. Yet here we are again, facing the same story told in a new form. Warnings ignored, cost-cutting prioritized, families paying the price. To longtime customers, the repetition is devastating. Trust was not lost in one scandal. It was eroded piece by piece, lawsuit by lawsuit, until faith in the badge on the grill gave way to suspicion. Each new revelation in the current recall echoes those past betrayals. The oil consumption scandal, the ignition switch crisis years before that. Again and again, engineers raise red flags, and executives bury them. Again and again, the truth only surfaces when regulators or lawyers pry it open. For drivers, the message is clear. This is not bad luck. It is not coincidence. It is a pattern, a culture that values cost savings over human safety, a company that has been given too many chances to do the right thing and keeps choosing the wrong one. And the more history repeats itself, the angrier drivers become, ready for the next chapter in the fight. Rivals smell blood. Ford and Toyota are not just selling trucks, they are stealing back your trust. In the brutal world of pickups, loyalty is everything. Families hand down brands like heirlooms, and for decades, GM counted on that loyalty as unbreakable. But the recall shattered that bond, and competitors wasted no time moving in. Ford launched conquest offers, dangling cash for anyone willing to trade their stricken Silverado or Sierra for a new F-150. Toyota filled the airwaves with reliability scores, targeting communities shaken by headlines of stranded trucks. The strategy worked because drivers were not just shopping for new vehicles, they were searching for reassurance. Billboards across the Midwest promised durability and peace of mind. Radio spots highlighted safety, not swagger. Dealerships handed out extended service plans and loaner vehicles, making the contrast with GM's plastic cap fix impossible to ignore. For households tired of feeling tricked, these gestures carried weight. Competitors knew that once a driver defected, the switch was often permanent. Pickup loyalty runs deep, but betrayal runs deeper. Ford, Toyota, and even upstarts in the electric truck space knew they only needed to open the door wide enough for disillusioned GM customers to step through. And every trade-in was more than a sale. It was a stolen vote of confidence. As rivals pressed the advantage on Main Street, another battle was brewing in Washington, where lawmakers smelled political opportunity. Washington wants a showdown. GM thought it could hide in Detroit, but now it is being dragged into Washington. Within weeks of the recall, congressional staffers began drafting hearing outlines. Safety committees eyed the scandal as primetime theater, a chance to grill executives under the glare of cameras. Senators rehearsed lines about dependability promises, colliding with engines dying on highways. For lawmakers, it was irresistible, a scandal they did not cause, but one they could use to score political points. In the Capitol, hearings are not about fixing engines, they are about optics. Executives facing microphones become symbols of arrogance or incompetence. Every shrug or carefully rehearsed answer risks becoming a viral clip. The spectacle practically writes itself. Stranded families contrasted with corporate lawyers in suits. Truth in advertising suddenly sounds less like a slogan and more like a cudgel. Meanwhile, insurance companies quietly recalculated their risk tables. Premiums for certain V8 trucks ticked upward, punishing families for defects they had no control over. Safety regulators pressed harder, demanding explanations for why GM delayed meaningful fixes. The financial pain multiplied, not just in lawsuits or repairs, but in everyday bills that owners now carried. The Washington spotlight exposed GM's core problem. The company could no longer hide. Behind the curtain of politics and grandstanding, another group began to wrestle with betrayal in a quieter but more personal way: the very workers who built the engines. You've seen how deep this scandal runs, but the story isn't finished. Subscribe right now so you don't miss the next revelation. Together, we'll uncover every detail and make sure the truth can't be buried. Workers on the line. The people who built your truck feel just as betrayed as you. On the factory floor, pride has always been tied to the machines rolling off the line. Generations of workers wore that badge with honor, believing they were building the toughest trucks in America. But when news spread of defective engines, pride curdled into shame. Men and women on assembly lines admitted to avoiding conversations about their jobs, unwilling to say out loud that they built vehicles now synonymous with breakdowns and lawsuits. Union halls became places of unease. Representatives heard whispers from workers asking why they were expected to keep assembling engines they knew contained defects. Some questioned the ethics of tightening bolts on blocks that could strand families at 70 miles per hour. The frustration grew into something sharper: resistance. Union leaders debated turning safety itself into a bargaining chip, demanding that contracts prioritize defect prevention over production quotas. For line workers, the betrayal was personal. They had trusted GM to deliver designs worthy of their craftsmanship. Instead, they felt like unwilling accomplices in a corporate scheme to cut corners. That emotional fracture rippled outward, shaking communities where GM paychecks supported schools, small businesses, and livelihoods. Workers realized they were standing on the same side of the line as drivers, both betrayed by the same corporate bosses. As labor braced for a fight, drivers themselves began to organize, not in union halls, but in garages, kitchens, and online forums. When owners fight back, this time, drivers are not waiting. They are organizing. For too long, owners trusted corporations to fix problems quietly. But after years of recalls and excuses, drivers learned to fight on their own terms. Vehicle identification numbers were typed into federal databases. Maintenance logs were scanned, cataloged, and shared. Owners began comparing oil reports and compression readings the way neighbors compare weather forecasts. Every rattle, tick, or hesitation became data in a growing grassroots campaign. Online forums transformed into war rooms. Families traded templates for filing complaints with regulators, instructions for preserving evidence, and checklists for demanding repairs. Grassroots groups sprang up across the country, drafting letters, collecting signatures, and demanding extended warranties or buybacks. What began as scattered frustration solidified into a community with a single voice: enough is enough. For contractors, farmers, and families, these efforts were not hobbies. They were lifelines, protecting livelihoods. And as voices grew louder, pressure seeped into headlines, boardrooms, and investor calls. Corporate strategy could stretch warranties and delay recalls, but it could not outlast a community united by betrayal. The uprising was not about engines alone. It was about power, who held it and who refused to give it back. And for the first time, it was not GM executives dictating the pace of the story. It was the very people they had dismissed, organized, determined, and unwilling to be silenced. Wall Street gets nervous. Trucks breaking down do not just kill engines, they kill stock prices. In the weeks following GM's massive recall, Wall Street traders began whispering the same fear: liability. Nearly 900,000 trucks pulled off the road is not just a mechanical issue, it is a financial landmine. Investors realized that lawsuits, buybacks, warranty extensions, and regulatory fines could swell into billions. Every chart that once pointed upward began to wobble. Analysts who once praised GM's cost-cutting reversed course as banks warned of exposure, and brokerage notes echoed what drivers claimed. Leadership gambled with trust, leaving shareholders to pay. Stock prices dipped, billions vanished, and pension funds grew anxious. The financial press called the recall a symbol of arrogance, branding greed Detroit's downfall. What was once marketed as GM's crown jewel of durability was now exposed as fake. As Wall Street crunched numbers and cut ratings, the bigger question was where GM would place its next bet. And that gamble carried consequences far beyond stock tickers. The gamble with America's future. GM is making a dangerous bet, doubling down on V8 trucks while families lose faith. Even as recalls dominated headlines, the company poured billions into new engine production at its Tonawanda plant, signaling that its future remained tied to gasoline-powered pickups. For executives, the math seemed clear. Trucks remain their biggest profit center, but for ordinary Americans, the decision looked reckless. Why keep pushing engines that many believe are defective? Why cling to a model that is bleeding loyalty when competitors are racing toward electric trucks and hybrids? To drivers, the gamble felt like déjà vu, the same short-term thinking that ignored early warnings and silenced engineers. GM's strategy seemed less like vision and more like stubbornness. The gamble goes deeper than fuel type. It is a cultural bet. For decades, pickups symbolized toughness, reliability, and American pride. Now, with safety questions and broken promises piling up, the foundation of that image is crumbling. GM is betting that memories fade, that lawsuits settle quietly, and that customers will return out of habit. But once trust is cracked, it rarely repairs itself. As GM leans harder on old formulas, rivals are rewriting the rules. And in this new era, the currency is not torque or towing power, it is trust, the new trust market. Trust is the new horsepower, and GM is running out of it fast. For generations, marketing slogans and glossy commercials could plaster over defects. But in the social media era, stories of failed engines and betrayed families travel faster than any television ad. Owners share pictures of seized trucks, lawyers post updates on lawsuits, and regulators release damning reports in real time. The illusion of indestructibility cannot be rebuilt with a 30-second spot during football. This shift is not about technology, but credibility. And once broken, trust becomes its own marketplace. Ford, Toyota, and Tesla understand this, selling peace of mind with longer warranties, transparent recalls, and visible commitments to safety. GM offers thicker oil and spin, deepening resentment. Loyalty once passed through families, but one roadside failure can erase generations. Rivals know loyalty rarely returns, so they invest heavily in making defections permanent. If trust is the new horsepower, then accountability is the fuel. And that sets the stage for what comes next, a fight not just over trucks, but over fairness itself. This fight isn't over. We are not just buying trucks anymore. We are buying accountability. The scandal surrounding GM's pickup engines has become more than a consumer issue. It is a national test of whether corporations can continue treating safety as a line item rather than a promise. Drivers are demanding honesty, fairness, and above all, protection for their families. The lesson is larger than Detroit. Every recall, every lawsuit, every viral story of betrayal chips away at the idea that big companies can shrug off responsibility. This is about more than engines. It is about the social contract. When people spend tens of thousands of dollars on vehicles, they expect security, not sabotage. Across forums, communities, and kitchen tables, that realization has hardened into resolve. Owners are not content with apologies. They want reforms, buybacks, and guarantees that no family will be left stranded again. They are sharing data, pressuring lawmakers, and using their collective voice to force change. GM may hope that time will dull the outrage, but outrage is not fading, it is organizing. And as long as drivers believe their trust has been stolen, the reckoning will continue. Because in the end, this fight is not just about trucks. It is about who gets to decide what safety, truth, and accountability mean in America. This fight isn't just about trucks, it's about trust. If you believe families deserve better than plastic caps and corporate cover-ups, don't stay silent. Hit that like button to push this story further, drop your experience in the comments, and share this video so more owners know the truth. Together, we can force accountability GM can't ignore.